Hello? Yep. Hey, everybody. We're about to start the next talk. So this is Timothy Grace, and he is going to be teaching you how to manage the risk for your unclassified info and your non-federal IT systems. So please, everybody, give him a warm round of applause, and he'll come up and give his talk.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Can you guys hear me in the back? All right. We're good. I saw a thumbs up. Great. So who can't? Somebody say they can't?
That's me, I'm sorry.
That was you, okay. You got to give up that blue shirt, just for saying that. No, so I'm Tim Grace. Here's kind of my background. I'm a Director of Technology Risk Advisory Services for Mueller Prost. We have a booth out there. We are a CPA and business advisor firm, but I head up this part of the practice. 35 years experience in information technology. I like to say that I spent 4 years as an accountant / regulatory accountant / financial auditor, but in reality, what they had me do was, why they hired me is because I had 10 years experience at that point, and they hired me to convert all of their dumb terminals or green screen terminals, some of the terms that some of the younger folks use, to desktops. So, my company is Mueller Prost. Been in business since 1983. Like I said, we're a CPA firm heavily involved in the tax area, financial services, assurance, attestation reviews, business valuation, but that's not what I do. I'm on the technology side. So, you know what I'm doing, what I look at everybody and watch them do, instead of pointing this thing at the computer and clicking, I'm pointing it at the screen, and it's not working. It's not working either way. Come on. There we go. Visit our booth. We're giving away a dope scope, which is a Wi-Fi device for finding rogue access devices, aka the Schrodinger scope. The question about is a Schrodinger scope, before you look into there, is that access device on or is it off? Is it there or is it not there? If you don't know anything about the Schrodinger box or the Schrodinger's cat, look it up on the internet. But we're giving this away. It's a pretty cool device. So let's jump into exactly what we're talking about. This is the session objective. If you've read the bio, if you've looked at what ShowMeCon's put out, this is what's on here. But we're going to talk about the controlled unclassified information, the executive order that was put into place, and what took place after the executive order. So let's jump right into it. What you need to know. Maybe I'm not close enough. So we're going to talk about the history of it, who needs to comply, guidance, and really what's the risk, because that's what it boils down to at the end. Let me see if I can fix this. Technology is great, except when it doesn't work. There we go. So, Executive Order 13556 was put into place, was signed into place November 10th, 2010 by President Barack Obama. What this basically said was that if you are an organization that has controlled unclassified information, you need to protect it. I highlight some things on here. The most interesting thing to me as I read through this order is excluding information that is classified under Executive Order 13526 as of December 29, 2009, which kind of leaves me a question. You're talking about unclassified information, which I get, but now you're telling me that unclassified or classified information did not have to be protected prior to 2009, which I think is a misnomer, but I guess they put that in the executive order. So the key things about, if you read this executive order, what it talks about, and the key words are non-federal systems and organizations. Everybody understands that you have to, if you're a federal organization, you have to protect your unclassified or your controlled unclassified information. I will say CUI is the acronym for it. So if you just go through it, highlight where it says non-federal systems. Non-federal systems and organizations, non-federal systems and organizations. As we go through this, we're going to explain exactly what they mean. what the executive order did was it really did two things. It turned to the National Archives and Record Administration, NARA, to develop exactly what CUI is. And they went through, and there's a whole list, and we'll show you some examples from the list, what exactly CUI is and what you need to do. And also went to the National Institute of Standards and Technology to say, hey, you got to devise a way for everybody to comply with this executive order and comply with the CUI that these organizations have in their system. So these are CUI categories. So if you go to the NARA website and you actually do a list of CUI, all you have to really do is go to Google and type in CUI categories. It'll pull up the NARA website. You can go to this and you can look and say, what is CUI? And so this is just some screen prints from their website. You can see up at the top the website is. So this one's on critical infrastructure. And as you can see, it goes over to the CUI categories, and it's all of that stuff under there. And there is a lot as you go through this. And so as we go through this, later on I'm going to give you a little more examples. So this is the website. If you click on any one of those categories over there, it'll take you into something else. It'll give you this screen, which actually describes exactly what it is. So we talked about, where is it? The second one, chemical terrorism vulnerability. That makes perfect sense. Why does that need to be protected? And it actually tells you why it needs to be protected, category descriptions, category markings, how you have to mark the information, the business format, working notes, and it also gives you some references down at the bottom, exactly what they're talking about and where to go for more information. Because this isn't necessarily a one-stop shop for all of your CUI information, but it's a place that kicks you off into other agencies, other documents, other sections of the federal government to tell you exactly what CUI is. So let's talk about the CUI markings, and I think there's a lot of confusion on this. Because as you go through NARA, as you go through Nist, and you look at what needs to be marked and what needs to be marked, some of this stuff is optional, and it's really left up to, one, the agency that the CUI might belong to, or the agencies that is working with the non-federal system that is in a non-federal organization. And it's really left up to the user exactly what needs to be marked. Now, there are some specific standards and guidelines on exactly what needs to be marked. And down at the bottom, you'll see how it needs to be marked. So you have to have a control marking to say, hey, this is CUI information. You have to have a category or subcategory, which goes back to the previous slides, and then limited dissemination control marking. Nothing to me on this says that, wow, this is something that's very difficult to do or hard to do, or something that we in the security world haven't been doing forever with security categorizations and whatnot with internal documentation or internal documents. So, come on. There we go. So just a sample of some CUI markings, and these are straight from the NARA website and from the Nist stuff. But you can see up at the top where they actually have it marked. It's CUI, how it's specified, and alphabetized CUI basic levels, and so on and so forth. So, you can go down and see exactly what the memo is about and how it should be marked. So, as we go further and further into this, I wanted to show everybody some examples of what exactly is CUI. So let me see a show of hands. Who's worked with CUI information before? Who understands this? Okay, so maybe about 10, 15% of you. So who hasn't heard about this in the past? So I'm seeing much more hands. So this is something, to me, as we go through this, as I started going through this and looking at this, and I've only been looking at this piece of it probably since 2016, 2017, it gets very scary exactly how NARA disseminated and said what exactly is CUI and who has to apply with CUI. So Few examples. If you do anything, if your organization is a financial organization, falls under the Comptroller General, and you can see the category description. So if it relates to duties, transactions, or otherwise falling under a purview, and this is the key, financial institutions are United States government fiscal functions. And I'm really keying in on the financial institutions there. You know, this thing's supposed to have a laser pointer too. I think my battery might be dying. Anyway, financial institutions. If you work for a bank, you have CUI information because you are a financial institution. So it's kind of scary. Intelligence. This one makes perfect sense. If you're dealing with the intelligence agencies, like we have NGA here, NSA, FBI, CIA, so on and so forth, it makes total sense you have to be able to keep this information controlled and make sure it's being controlled. Let me try something because my clicker's not working. I'm going to switch to the ShowMeCon clicker. Bear with me, sorry guys. This one's not working either. Hey, that might help. Hey, give me a round of applause. I know how to work technology. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I'll be back to do this tomorrow night too. So privacy. This is the one that got me. When I first saw this, so my wife, 2 years ago, we did the DNA testing. Went through that process. And I'm thinking, wow, some company out there has my DNA. My spit, I spit in a jar and send it to them. And they need to protect that information. That's CUI information. So if you've ever done DNA testing, and by the way, I'm Irish, and I'm also Scandinavian, so I guess I'm an Irish Viking. So, meaning I can talk forever if you want me to. And since I'm part Viking, right, words may not come out of my mouth that people like, so. And if you get me drinking, that's a whole different story. So, so again, privacy, health information. If you do anything with health information, that's CUI. That has to be protected. Now, that also ties into HIPAA, which also ties into high tech. So it's very important. If you have any of that, you have to know what you have, and you have to be aware of the Nist 800-171, which that we'll describe later. Doesn't necessarily, like I indicated, doesn't necessarily mean you have to market according to the standard, but somebody may say you have to market, so it's something to look at. Financial information, electronic funds transfer. If you do any type of funds transfer, banks do funds transfers, wire transfers, ACHs, that's CUI information. That has to be protected. Let me point one more thing out. Down here at the bottom, tax information. So if you're a company that does taxes for individuals, for companies, for organizations, that tax information is considered CUI. You have to comply with this as well. Later on, we'll talk about the risk on not complying and what it means if you're not complying. So determine your compliance. You have to determine what in your organization is covered. What in your organization is CUI, which means you have to go through an exercise to discover what you have in your organization that is CUI and what needs to be protected and how it needs to be protected. And the big thing about this is you have to have a cyber incident reporting system, a process. That's a requirement. So if there is a dissemination of your CUI information, you have to be able to report that, and you have to be able to track that. And you have to have a system security plan and a plan of action if you are not compliant. So a system security plan will say, yes, you are compliant. No, you're not compliant. And there's 110 controls to be compliant with. Maybe you're only compliant with 100 of them. So those other 10, you have to have a plan to get compliant. Whether that's to get compliant within 6 months or 60 years, as long as you have a plan. Here's some other resources. The one thing about the CUI is it's now written into the DFARS, which is the Defense Federal Acquisition Regulation. Do I have it spelled out up there? I always miss what the S means. As well as the Federal Acquisition Regulation. The DFAR is for defense contractors and defense. The FAR is for civilian contractors. The one thing to note, and I've learned this, I guess the hard way a little bit, is if there's a FAR and you have a federal contract, you have to comply with every single one of the FARs. Even if there's only 10 FARs specified in your contract, the other 200 some odd FARs that are out there are DFARs. You can't say, well, you didn't put it in my contract, I don't have to comply with it. You have to comply with that. So there's no saying, well, you didn't specify a federal government contractor, department. Yeah, it doesn't matter. You still have to comply with it. And then there's Nist guidance. Nist has a lot of good guidance on it. So some of the ones, okay, so now we get into the Nist 800-171. So remember the date, November 2010, when this executive order was put into place. I don't have a date exactly when the CUI categories were developed. I probably need to dig in and do some more research, but somewhere between 2010 and 2015, when they released the first Nist Special Procedure 800-171, which is protecting controlled unclassified information, again, in non-federal information systems organizations. That's when it first came out. It was last updated in 2016. Now, it was superseded by Revision 1, which was published in December 2016, last updated in 2018. Now, the one key to this is you have the 171, and then you have the 171A. So if you look through any of the Nist stuff, and there's a 171 or an 053 or something, if there's an A, that's the assessment guide. That's how you assess your organization per this. So there is an A, which was actually released in 2018. I will explain in a minute why that was important. So we're going to talk about Revision 1. Again, highlighted words. It's protecting the confidentiality of CUI when CUI is resident in non-federal systems and organizations. Again, that's the key to this whole thing. Non-federal systems and organizations. When your system is collecting or maintaining information on behalf of a federal agency, okay, that makes sense. If you're collecting information on behalf of a federal agency, yeah, absolutely, the government can say you need to ensure that it's being protected. But then you have that R in there. Or maintaining information on behalf of or using an operating, that should be an. My spelling is terrible. Or using an operating, what am I talking about? Or using or operating a system on behalf of an agency. So if you're using or operating a system, again, that needs to be protected. But you drop down a little bit further. The security requirements apply only to components of non-federal systems. This is a key, non-federal systems that process, store, or transmit CUI or that provide security protection for such components. Does not necessarily mean that you're dealing directly with a federal agency. You may fall under the purview of a federal agency, such as the IRS with tax information, FDIC with banking information. I could go on and on. You know, I think I may have skipped the one slide. There was a slide in here. I might have deleted it because this is like the third time I've done this presentation. But there was one point I wanted to make when I talked about CUI categories. In agriculture, there's a CUI category in agriculture. So one point I'd like to make is the categories are very subjective. So if you are a dairy farmer and you milk cows and you send your milk off for processing, the milk, that information is subject to CUI. To me, I don't know, that may be stretching it, but it's subject to CUI. And there's arguments on both sides. So let's talk about 871. So in 871, it actually points out 4 things that you have to comply with. The FIPS 199, which is very standard and straightforward. The FIPS 200. The Nist 863. And then it points to the 853. And so I know some of you that have dealt with the 853 know that this document and the controls you have to comply with are gigantic. There's like 650 controls. So before the 800-171A came out, everybody was pointing to the 53, which gets really confusing. And if you don't work with it on a day-to-day basis and you're not deeply into the 053, you don't know exactly what you have to comply with. Because in order to get to what you have to comply with, you have to know the categorization of your systems, whether it's a high, moderate, or low. And different system categorizations have different controls that you have to put into place. So if you're a low, maybe it's 120 of those controls. If it's a moderate, then it's those 120 plus the next 80, so about 200. But if it's a high, it's not the 650, it's probably somewhere around 600, because there are controls in there that you don't necessarily, nobody has to comply with. They're there, they can be selected, but they're not always selected. So, the 171, it's a diverse, it's supposed to be, people are supposed to be able to use it. You don't necessarily have to use it for CUI, and I actually recommend folks to look at the 853 or the 53 as well as the 171. And instead of going with something like ISO, COBIT, something else, maybe you look at this, because this is a pretty comprehensive group of controls that you should comply with, and a pretty comprehensive process that should be put into place, that could be used. Who are my CISSPs in here? So what do they talk about when they talk about confidentiality, integrity, and availability? Isn't it the other way around? When you study for it, it's instead of the CIA, it's the AIC, right? Am I right? Yeah. Is it CIA in there? I thought it was AIC. Okay. There's some guidance that actually talks about AIC, but it's the same thing. So this is how you figure out exactly what systems, what data within your systems are CUI, what systems are CUI or are actually related to it. So low, moderate, or high. So you got the confidentiality, the impact. You could have a low, moderate, low system and it would be considered moderate. You could have a low, high system and it's considered high. You could have a high, low, and it's still considered high. So whichever one is on top is the highest. That's the one that categorizes your system. 853. There's actually a pretty nice mapping between 171 and 853 that's in the back of 171. Which is, kind of doesn't, it's good that it's there, but with the release of 171 last June, you really don't have to go to 853 anymore. So there's basic security requirements and there's derived security requirements. The difference is the basic ones are kind of how you establish and track this, and then the derived ones are really how you put it into place. I wish I would have done a slide that actually compares the control families in 53 to control families in 171. But you can see these are the control families in 171. It's pretty high level at this point, but if you look at any type of security guidance, literature, anything standards, it's pretty basic and it's pretty simple. As you get into this stuff, it gets more and more complex. System security plans. So before the 800-171A came out last year, you actually went to 053 and you developed your security plans based on that, or based on the 800-37 which is the risk management framework. What they did to simplify this was kind of cool, and it made it a lot easier. As I've done several of these audits, instead of developing a system security plan from scratch, or using something that you found from a various agency, and it seems like every agency is a little bit different, they actually gave you guidance. So you got to identify the system. You got to talk about what type of environment, what the requirements section is. And then it drops down to the actual control. So access control. You can actually click if it's implemented, if you plan to be implemented, or some of the stuff might not be applicable at all. Obviously, access control is not applicable, but there's other things within there that may not be applicable to your environment. POAMs. Anybody's heard the term POAM? All my federal people that have worked with this in the past. So this is really your issues. As you're going through the assessment and you identify gaps, what they want you to do is put together a plan of action. Plan of action and milestones. So it's plan of action. Here's how I'm going to fix this, and here's the milestones. So I have to harden my system. So I'm going to harden it. Here's what I'm going to do, and here's the milestones. I'm going to do these 10 servers by July 30th, 31st. These 10 by August 30th, and I'm going to have the whole process done, not just completed, implemented, or remediated, but I'm also going to have testing performed again. So you perform testing after you fix the issue. So this is from the 171A. So you can see the difference. So up at the top, the 3.6, the incident response, this is what you had to look at and comply with. Now, as an auditor, as a past auditor, some of this, you look at it, establish an operational incident handling capability for organizational systems. Okay, so you got to comply with that. So how do you write your audit steps? How do you write your assessment steps? And I think this is where, as a organization, you get into a lot of trouble, you get into a lot of overwork, and you put a lot of time into taking it from where it's at up there, the basic security requirements, and say exactly what that means, down to when they released the 171A, exactly what they wanted you to do. So some people say, it's a versus. It's not a versus, but it's how the documents complement each other. So the A is the assessment piece. And as you can see at the bottom, there's the security requirement, track, document, report incidents. And here's the steps, which are called determine ifs. Make sure that are incidents tracked? Are they documented? Authorities to whom incidents are reported and identified. So this actually gives you the individual steps that you want to comply with, and you want to make sure that your organization complies with and your system complies with. This is the mapping table, which is kind of cool. It maps. Not only does it map to Nist 853, but it also maps to ISO 27001. And if you do a Google search, if you want to say, okay, I don't really care if it maps to ISO. Does it map to PCI? Does it map to high tech? Does it map to high trust? Does it map to something else, CSC, something else out there? If you do a Google search, there's a ton of stuff out there. Somebody's put it together somewhere. So go check that out. So steps to comply. Know what your CUI data is. I suggest doing a survey. Send it out to all your department heads, individuals, asking exactly what CUI they have. I wouldn't say, gee, tell me what your CUI is, but I would go through the categories and list things that may be CUI within your business. Send that out, see what you get. And in that way, once you understand that, then you target those specific systems, those specific processes. Your network is probably going to be CUI information. You're probably going to have to include that in there. Depending on how many systems, how many processes you have, you may have multiple system security plans. So you could have one for your network. You could have one for your platform. You could have one for your GRC system. You could have one for your ERP system, your accounting, so on and so forth. You could just go down the line to determine how many you have. So you could have one for the entire organization, or you could have 10, 20, 30. It really adds up after time. Perform a gap analysis. Look at and document where your gaps are. Some people don't like to call these audits, but at the end of the day, it is an audit. It really is an assessment to see where you're at. And then based on that, develop plans of action and milestones for the non-compliant controls. How are you going to make your system compliant? As I said, there's 110 CUI controls. When you get down to the determine ifs, it jumps up to 560. So there's a lot of determine ifs that you have to answer. Remediate, mitigate, and compensate. So either fix it, you find something where that mitigates that control, or compensates that control. Got to have an incident reporting process. And don't forget, if you have to, make sure you mark your CUI information. So here's the risk. I know I talked about this, and the interesting thing about this is, sorry, my voice is going. It's what happens when you sit at a booth and talk to people all day. By the end of the day, your voice starts going. So if you're a government contractor, you definitely have to comply with this. What would happen if you don't? Government could say you're no longer getting a contract, at the very least. They could put you on a list to ban your organization from bidding on future contracts. They could actually fine you. Now, some of this hasn't quite happened yet. Some of this has happened where they said, you guys have to comply. Tell us how you're going to comply. Tell us when you're going to comply. I know DOD came out and said they're really going to start cracking down on their vendors, their contractors, to ensure that they're complying with this. So if you're a DOD contractor, if you work for companies like Boeing or Lockheed Martin or General Dynamics, you deal with the federal government all the time. More than likely, you already have a program in place. If you are a smaller agency, say you're a contractor that you don't provide anything to them, you just provide services, you have to comply. I worked for a government contractor, and we had to comply. We had to go through a whole process to ensure that we comply with this. So, subcontractors. If you're a subcontractor, and here's where it gets complicated. So the contractor's dealing directly with the government. The government will say, yes, you have to comply. Okay, you got a plan to comply. Let's get into compliance. Maybe you get a small fine. But if you're a subcontractor, your main contractor, so using Boeing as an example, if you're developing widgets for Boeing, they could say, how are you complying? Oh, you're not complying. We're going to pull your contract till you comply. I mean, that's probably the worst thing that a contractor could do. And if you're a small company and you have, maybe you have $50 million in revenue and $7, $8, $9, $10 million is tied up as a subcontractor with a company like Boeing, and they all of a sudden say, well, you're not compliant. You can't show me you're compliant. We're going to pull your contract. Now you're in trouble. Now you're trying to struggle and figure out exactly how you're going to do this. You're losing revenue, which means you're losing income, which means now you have to have the expense of going forth and complying with this, which, you know what, it's not that expensive, but it's not that cheap. It could cost you anywhere from $50,000 to $200,000, $250,000 to get a contractor to comply with it. Or you could try to comply internally, which means you're going to spend the same money, but it's going to be kind of hidden within things. There's other downstream organizations. You may be an organization that deals with a subcontractor that deals with a federal contractor, and you may not even know that you have to comply with this until somebody comes knocking on the door. And then you could be in a lot of trouble. The last one, other companies doing business in the United States. You may not even know you have to comply. And I'm going to use the tax companies just as an example. This is from my own mind. Say you're a company and you do taxes, and you have a dispute with the IRS, and IRS agent says, "Oh, you're not doing these people's taxes correctly," and so you have there's a lawsuit, you have litigation. You go forth, get lawyers involved, spend a lot of money, and you win the litigation. That IRS agent that pushed the litigation, how do you think he's going to feel, or she's going to feel? What do you think they're going to be thinking? They're not going to be happy that they pushed this and they lost the case. So then they're going to come back to you and say, "Hey, how are you guys complying with 171A?" "I don't know, never heard of it." "Well, you never heard of it, that's your problem. Now we're going to come after you with this. So it's going to happen. Somebody somewhere is going to say, "How is your company complying with this if they haven't complied already?" And they're going to come after you. And these are just a list of things that could happen, all the way from termination of contract down to criminal liability. Questions? Got about 15 minutes left. Questions? Way back there. I can't hear you, sorry. I've heard bits and pieces, especially on the subcontractor to contractor basis, where they've actually said, "Hey, you have to comply. Tell us how you're going to comply with this. And if you're not going to comply with this, we can no longer deal with you." Working with a company in the healthcare space right now, that they're a smaller company, they're dealing with one of the big, large insurance companies. That insurance company came to them. They actually came to them beginning of 2018 and said, "You have to comply with this." So this company, instead of going down the path with 171A, which wasn't around beginning of 2018, they went with 053. So now they're stuck looking at those 650 controls to see how they're complying with it. And I actually just got involved with this company earlier this year to say, okay, you're going through this whole list, which means they've categorized all their system as high. So their systems are high. They didn't need to do that. They could have said it was moderate, because most of their systems are really moderate according to FIPS 200. So I've seen limited, but it's like a snowball. It's coming. 5 years from now, a year from now, who knows how quickly it's going to come. So, any other questions? Nope.
Is it still a self-attestation?
You know, as a consultant, I'd like to say, no, you have to come to me. But realistically, it can be a self-attestation. You can go through it yourself. Yeah.
Are there any exemptions for, say, that dairy farmer that's literally one person? Or would he have to go through the full compliance effort?
So, that's a good question. I don't know.
You know, like how if you're under 50,
Yeah. I haven't seen where there's any exemptions like that. But, I mean, it all gets into risk. If you're one guy and maybe you're providing, milk to a couple local stores around your farm because you have 10 cows, I don't know. What's the risk? You run the risk of getting caught. But realistically, I don't think they're going to go after the big guys. It's like GDPR. So when I talk about GDPR, when I give people advice on GDPR, it's, you're a small company. Yeah, you're in Europe. You're doing this stuff. Comply the best you can. Make sure you have a privacy policy. Make sure it's posted. Make sure you let everybody know what's going on. But wait and look and see what happens to the big guys. The Googles, the Facebook, everything. Wait till litigation hits. Now, even with that, you're not protected. Somebody could say, hey, you have to comply. Why aren't you complying? Let's go through this process. And then the dairy farmer sits down with the 171, looks at those 560 questions, determine ifs, goes through them and say, you know what? This doesn't apply, this doesn't apply, this is not selected, not selected. Oh, geez, you know what? Yeah, I do have an online system. Who has access to it? Well, I have access to it. My wife has access to it. So we've set up the proper access controls. So when you first think about it and look at it, it may seem like a daunting task, but it's really not that daunting as you take pieces of it, chunks of it. So, yeah. Okay. Anybody else? Speak up, because I'm kind of going deaf. When you get old, you go deaf. So, I actually have that question, because when they updated, the last update to 171 was last June. And at the time, remember that slide that had those 4 things you got to comply with? The FIPS 199, the FIPS 200, the 853, and then the 860. They didn't take that line out when they came out with the 171. But they're pointing to the 171 saying you have to comply with, I'm sorry, not 171, the 171A. They're saying you have to comply with 171A. So, as far as I'm concerned, the way I advise folks is you no longer have to look at the 53. You got to go to the 171A. That's what you should comply with. And I can't see anybody saying, okay, you complied with 171A, but you didn't do the 53, which the 53 is spelled out in 171. Why didn't you comply with that? Well, because there's an A now. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Is there anything covered in this that's not covered in industry or other regulatory or standard requirements? For example, you had financial transactions that's covered under PCI, you had health information, which is under HIPAA, there's working with the federal government, which is FedRAMP, right, and mostly in state under 53. So is there anything in here that is brand new, not covered anywhere else?
Nothing that I've seen.
So if you're PCI compliant and you have financial transactions, you're good to go, you don't have to worry about this.
Not necessarily. I would go through the exercise. I would dump all of this into a spreadsheet, and I'd say, this is how I comply with this. Because if you don't, you could say, I'm compliant with PCI, I've got my ROC, and here's how I'm compliant. And somebody could say, we don't care about PCI. Show us the document that says 171A on there. I mean, it seems like, okay, I'm doing double the work, and you really are, but you're covering yourself.
But the concern would be less, right? So if you know that,
Well, yeah. So so if you're compliant, and there's mappings. Everybody's done mapping. There's tons of mappings out there. So if you get the mapping and you say, okay, here's the PCI control from the DSS, and here's the Nist control that I need to comply with. But while there's almost a perfect match there, here's how I comply with it. You've got it. So it's not that big of a stretch. It may be a paper exercise, and you know what? You may come up with 1 or 2 items that it's like, wow, you know what? We never considered this. It's not necessarily in PCI. So, yeah. So
there's no groundbreaking anything. There's nothing earth-shattering.
No. Yeah. As I look through this, it's like 10 years ago when I started going down the path of getting involved in the 53. The company that I was dealing with said, tell me your experience. And I kind of danced around that question because I had never been a federal contractor. As we all do in interviews, right? When you don't know something, you either say, I don't know it. I kind of knew it. I kind of knew what 53 was, and I went to 53 for certain audit programs I had developed in the past. But I didn't know exactly everything that was involved in doing, and this really goes into the FISMA, the Federal Information Security Management or Modernization Act. I really didn't know everything that went into it, but I could say that yes, access control, the way they talk about access control, family in 53 is something similar to what I've done. It maps to COBIT, it maps to ISO, it maps to the DSS. There may be one or two things that are different, but for the most part, you're going to be covered. It's just going through that paper exercise. Any other questions? I'm sorry, I can't hear you. They should give you a microphone. We got a microphone? Well, what business do you do? So, do you have to comply with ITAR? Sorry, you're a manufacturer. I mean, you probably don't necessarily have to comply with it, but to be honest with you, if you go through this, you go through the assessment piece, it's a good thing to do, even if you don't have to comply with it. It's a good judgment, and I actually like the Nist documents and the way they're laid out better than a lot of the other guidance that I've done, like COBIT or ISO. Because it gives you that control statement at a higher level. And this one actually goes in and tells you those determinants exactly what questions to ask. So, I mean, even if your company doesn't comply with it, doesn't need to comply with it, doesn't need to look at it, it's always good to look at and ensure that, make sure you're compliant with it. So, yeah. Any other questions?